the equipment that you need. So your humidity bag, your spawn bag, your spray bottle, your hygrometer / thermometer, and a sharp knife. So otherwise, that's all you basically need. I have a couple of other things, some mask and my alcohol. And the reason behind that is because my bag is not fully colonized. So I'm going to be doing the step for fruiting, but I want to be a little extra careful. So basically where we're going right now with all of this is that if your bag has fully colonized, you'll see that for mine, I don't know if you guys can accurately see that, but it is starting to fruit. This is a lion's mane, so you can start seeing that there's a whole bunch of lion's mane already growing on the top, but it hasn't already gone. Like if I look at the back here, it's still mostly uncolonized. The reason behind that is because I had a new setup for growing mushrooms, and it was way too cold, and I only realized it a few days into having all my grow kits there. So it was dropping to about 14 degrees overnight and basically just stopping all colonization. So everything that I have in my fruiting area is basically was on pause. So now everything was back up to temp and catching up. But so I'm going to be acting a little bit more sterile than you need to, though if you're at the same stage, you can follow along, but you should also be a little more careful. You don't have to worry about contamination if you have a fully colonized block, basically. So this stage that we're doing now is supposed to be for those who have a fully colonized block. You're getting ready to go into the fruiting now. It's already colonized, you're good to go. Now you're just going to start that fruiting process. So for me, I'm going to do basically all the same thing as well, but I have to be particularly careful that I don't open it up in areas where it's not colonized, because if I do that, then I'm basically allowing an area for the contaminants to get in and start killing my block. So that being said, we'll get going. So basically the first step we're going to be doing with our bag is knocking out that air. We don't necessarily need, so when we created this in stage 3, the air pocket was essentially there in order to allow for just a little extra space for the oxygen, or a little bit extra space for the carbon dioxide that gets emitted. But when you're fruiting, basically, as you can see from mine, because there's that open area, that's where the mushrooms are going to start fruiting from. And we don't actually want the mushrooms to fruit from there. So what we're going to do is actually collapse this bag now and completely tighten it against that top surface so that the mushrooms don't grow from up there. Now, theoretically, you could have it grow from up there. There's no reason why, the top is worse than the side or what have you. But a lot of people have a much larger surface on the side, and so that's where they want it. Plus, once you pull this all down, you're going to have kind of a excess plastic kind of going on, and it makes it all kind of messy. So this patch is no longer going to be required because we're going to be cutting open the bag in order to fruit. So it's going to have all that oxygen already in there, right? So basically all we're going to be doing is doing a small puncture on this, literally a small puncture. We really don't want too much. We want to just blow out that air and then fold that plastic on top. Again, if you have a fully colonized block, this isn't too much of a concern because you really don't expect to get any contaminants. But the purpose of the bag in the fruiting stage is to trap in that humidity. So if you, make a massive hole in it, then you have a higher likelihood of losing that humidity. So something we're going to try to avoid doing. So where I'm going to actually puncture mine is going to be right above where this is most colonized in me. Actually, I'm going to blow it out right where there is. Yeah. So I'm going to need to fold it over. So I'm going to do it right. So I got a whole bunch of colonized side here. So that's where I'm going to puncture it, just on the side here. That way I can blow it out. If you're doing this, I would say be a little careful. There are spores in there. I mean, you're not going to get harmed by lion's mane spores or oyster spores, but kind of one of those things, everything in moderation. There's spores in the air anyways. Every breath you take, you're going to be taking in thousands of spores. But we want to do our best to not, breathe in mouthfuls, clouds of spores. So just blowing out the air there. This is basically all carbon dioxide that I'm blowing out at this point. So for me, I'm just going to fold this over. Doesn't need to be pretty. Basically it. So still some space, if you will, between the bag and that top layer. If you can, prevent that, plastic and it's a substrate, so it's going to be a little difficult. But basically whatever space you give it, it's going to allow for those mushrooms to grow in that space. And the point right now is to essentially have it focus its energy on growing in areas that are a little bit better to grow. So because mine isn't fully colonized, I can't actually cut open my block like you guys can do. But basically that's what you're going to be looking for. All right. So if you didn't have that much air in there, then you might not even need to cut open the bag. But now that you have this block, right, you're gonna have that to the side. Basically, you would do a nice slice with your sharp knife right into the substrate, right? Now, sorry, what I said was into the substrate. You do not want to have it actually in the substrate. So, I would put the knife in kind of sideways, just tear open the bag. You don't want to cause too much damage to the actual substrate itself. That's all mycelium there. If you cut open the substrate and you cut through that mycelium, then you're basically going to make it have to repair all those mycelium networks before it can start fruiting. So you don't want to cut open that mycelium there. So you just do a nice slice, a nice X across, and then that's where it would be fruiting from. Now, that being said, you have a choice when you're fruiting your blocks. Basically, you can choose to have a one side that's been cut, or you can go two sides. Okay, cut. Some species do better with one, some do better with two, but really the reasoning behind one and two is on you guys. If you cut, normally what happens is that this block right now is fully hydrated and ready to go. It's ready to fruit. And when you cut open one side, it's going to fruit out. It's going to be a nice, big, beautiful cluster of mushrooms. And then usually what happens is that people then kind of try to cover that up, and you're going to try to get the other side of fruit. Usually it's kind of like, imagine this being two separate blocks, even though it's not. When you fruit out one side, it's basically going to take all the nutrients from one side of the bag. And then you can cut open on the other side to get all the nutrients out the other. So you're rarely going to get two fruitings from the exact same spot, right? You're going to get one from one side and you're going to get a second from the other side. So do you want to cut on both sides right away? Or do you want to cut on one side and then a little later, after you harvest that first cluster, you cut open the second, you get a second flush. So if you do the first one and you do just one side, you're going to get a very large cluster. But during that time, it's going to absorb a lot of the nutrients and a lot of the moisture within that block. So your second flush is going to be considerably smaller than your first, right? But they're going to be spaced out. So you might get, a big cluster that you can, enjoy for, let's say, a week, right, of dinners, etc. And then during that time, after you cut it, you slice this one, and then that one's going to start fruiting, and now you have a second week, let's say, of mushrooms. So that's nice to space it out if that's what your intentions are. If you're trying to get as much mushroom yield as possible, and timeline doesn't really matter, then you cut both. So it's generally shown that if you cut on both sides at the same time, then it has an equal kind of distribution of its nutrients and an equal distribution of its humidity, et cetera, et cetera. And so the two sides will grow basically at the same tempo, and you'll get a much larger yield from your block. So that's kind of your choice. But then if you get, let's say 5 pounds of mushrooms, unless your plan is to preserve them or to hand them out, you're probably not going to be able to consume them all that quickly, or maybe you have a large family. So do you want that many mushrooms at one go is really the question. So those are your options. Maybe you want to this time just to see how many mushrooms you really get out of it. Maybe you want to cut on both sides, but it also depends on where you're going to be positioning your pack. So that's the next step here. So once you cut it, that's where it's going to be fruited out of. The other thing to keep in mind of where your mushrooms will want to fruit is their lighting conditions. So oftentimes mushrooms will want to kind of grow where the light is shining, right? That's kind of a good symbol. So it's not going to grow in the center of the block, obviously. It's going to be growing, whether it be this side, all sides can grow mushrooms. Now, usually you'll never see it on the bottom because that's always down, right? And so there's no actual light that's going to the bottom of the bag. So no mushrooms will grow. And the same can be true for your actual bag. So if you decide to cut on both sides, you kind of want to have both sides exposed to some sort of indirect light. Ideally, all the other sides would not have light going towards them. Now, that doesn't really, it doesn't change the world if you do have light on the whole block. If you go to, when we go to JCB's cultivation farm, for example, you see, and this is true basically of any cultivation farm I've seen, they basically just have the blocks sitting there on the shelves, all lined up. There's no box, there's no anything, it's just a whole bag. So, they do get exposed the entire block to indirect light, but sometimes they do have, quite a bit of growing in areas that they would prefer it not to grow. It's easier to not have to manage, all the different sides. So that being said, it's up to you. If you do have a way, or if you, for example, even if you just have this pushed up against the wall, right? The wall is going to block out some of the light. So that's one side that's going to block the light. And you got another side that's down. So that's going to block out some light. And maybe you have something that you can put on top, right? That's going to block out some light to the top as well. Then that's fantastic. Now you have two sides that are going to be fruiting, and you have three sides that are blocked. And maybe you can do something with the sixth side, but again, it doesn't change the world. So those are all just options to allow for it. So that's going to help you kind of decide where you're going to be putting your grow kit. So last thing here is the humidity. So this is the humidity tent, right? So in here, you'll see that there's slits. Those slits are basically the right size to allow for the airflow to occur. Okay, what I like to normally do is kind of crumple it up a little bit, just to make sure that they get properly separated. Sometimes those little cuts aren't, fully cut, and so I just like to kind of give them a little bit of a helping hand, if you will. Just kind of open them up, stick my finger inside of each of the holes, really. A lot of the humidity tents on the internet, just FYI, are there are some options out there. I find that usually they sell them and the holes are way too big. They'll be maybe of the size of a toonie kind of thing. With a big hole like this, and then they'll have 50 of them or something like that. And you just can't keep any humidity inside of a tent that has that many holes that large. And that's the whole point of the humidity tent, right? Is to ensure that it traps in that humidity. Do this last row here. There we go. Okay. So I puncture it all. Now, to form our tent, we're basically going to make it inside out. We're going to keep the ledge on the end that we just did. So it's not going to be fully inside out. We want to keep just, you know, an inch or so. And we can even do an extra little fold at the end, just like thicken it up. Okay. That's just to provide it with some structural integrity so that it actually stays up when it's required to. There you go. So
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is that ledge on the inside or on the outside?
That's on the outside.
On the outside. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it really matters. Besides the fact that it will probably trap in a bunch of humidity if it's on the inside, right? Because if I have my ledge there, this is going to be humid in there. So by being on the outside, at least it stays dry, and then you don't have to worry about cleaning that in future uses of it. Obviously, this bag is reusable. So that's basically how it would go. So inside the humidity tent now is the grow bag. Pretty simple. And basically what we would just do is we got our spray bottle, right? And you can just go like this. So right now we're trying to get a solid humid level in there. So you're probably going to want to get in as much water as possible. When you're actually growing these, basically your fruiting bodies. So imagine that this bag was already cut, right? So it was already slit, maybe on both sides. This will allow it, all right? This is a pretty big bag, so this will allow it to grow on both sides pretty easily. Your fruiting bodies will want between 80 and 90% humidity. So that's why we have our little hygrometer. Now remember that hygrometers are notoriously not the most accurate regardless. And it doesn't really matter what hygrometer you get on the market. Hygrometers by default just aren't amazing. So take this always with a grain of salt. I like to put it on top of the bag, but it doesn't really matter where you put it. I find that humidity drops, it's heavier than you know the rest of the air, so it's going to be more humid on the actual ground at the level. And when you spray it a lot, you might get a little bit of pooling of water kind of thing. So some people put trays underneath. You might have this on, you know, a towel or something like that. It's not a bad idea. In fact, actually have a towel simply because, you know, it's going to trap some of that moisture and it's going to give it back off. So not a terrible idea. Again, we're not too concerned about contamination here. So basically everything that's going in here, you don't need to actually be, you know, too clean about it. If you do have something like a towel in there, I would suggest changing it once in a while, though, because we get moldy in an 80 to 90% humidity chamber. So I put in my hygrometer here, and this is only a few spritz. Really, I should have, you know, maybe about 30 spritz in there in the first go around. When I held it up here, I had about 38% humidity. I put it in there and it's climbing right now. It's at 66, and that was only with like 5 spritzes. So that's kind of the point, right? So we want to just keep on misting this. And you're going to be misting it multiple times a day at this point. Ideally, you know, you're looking at maybe 3 times a day and, you know, maybe about 20 mists. But really, it's that hygrometer that's going to kind of govern, you know, whether or not there's sufficient humidity in there. So keep an eye on that and mist, you know, you basically can't over mist, right? I mean, you're looking at 80 to 90% humidity. So when the actual fruit bodies start to grow, the key is not to actually mist the fruit bodies, right? You do not want to be misting the actual fruit bodies, nor do you want to really be misting the actual substrate itself. You can harm the mycelium by spraying directly on mycelium. So you're just trying to get in the general area, right? And, you know, again, things do hold off water, and when they hold off water, they evaporate it. So like you can just spray the bags, for example, like I'm spraying the bag, right? I'm not spraying any actual mushrooms, just the bag itself, maybe the inside of the tent, right? Those are all options. And then you cover it all up, and there we go. Everything is wet in there. So it's going to hold on to a lot of that humidity. Now this bag is also going to want to be put in an area. So essentially now what we're trying to do, right, is recreate the autumn, right? So things are starting to get a little more wet. Things are starting to, you know, wrap up for the winter. And with that obviously comes cooler temperatures. So a lot of these will actually start doing better now if you drop the temperature. It's fully colonized, it's ready to go, and you want to drop that temperature. Now, room temperature is usually fine. The ideal temperature for most of our species, because I don't think anyone's growing any of the exotic ones like pink oyster mushrooms, for example. That's like a rainforest species, and it requires warmer temperatures. But for lion's mane and all the oysters, et cetera, that we're growing, basically at this point, when we're ready to fruit them, we actually want that temperature to drop ideally to between 16 and 20 degrees Celsius, or 60 to 68 Fahrenheit. So obviously most people here don't have that temperature, right? Their house probably is warmer than 16 to 20. And if you put it outside, obviously for most of us, that would be way too cold. So again, as I mentioned in pretty much all the other stages, the ideal situation is you know, a consistent temperature regardless. And if you could get a drop in temperature, even if it's by 1 degree, 2 degrees, that's going to help the mycelium understand that it's getting cooler outside. So even if it's not that big of a drop, a smaller drop is better than nothing, but you can only do what you can do. If you want to grow it just at room temperature, that's fine, but try to find one of the cooler areas of the house. There are a couple of questions here. So does it matter, Corley? Oh, you asked both questions. Does it matter if the holes are pointed up or to the side? No, it doesn't matter. I mean, all these holes are already in there for you, right? So
I meant in the side of the, not the tent, in the bag.
oh, on the bag. Doesn't matter if the holes are pointed. Like, you mean cut a hole in the top of the bag?
No, I'm like in the block, when
Yeah.
you do the cross, does it
Yeah.
have to point upward or sideways, or does it matter?
It doesn't really matter.
Okay.
So wherever you cut that, right, it's just that's where you're telling it that you want it to fruit there. So you might actually choose an area where it's already starting to fruit, right? Because you're like, well, cool. I mean, it's already started, so why not slice there and allow it to grow there? But in other areas you might not want to. If you cut, thing is that you're basically going to grow ideally from two sides at some point, right? Either right away or a little later, you're going to be growing it from two sides. And you want them to be on polar opposite sides of the block. So if you were to cut the top, right, of the bag, then theoretically you'd have to then cut the bottom of the bag, right? So then you'd be putting the bag on its side in order to cut it. And now you're just cutting the sides, basically, right? But the top of the bag has a lot more plastic to go around, and the bottom of the bag also has a seam. So you're kind of destroying the integrity of the bag by, you know, going with the top and bottom approach as opposed to any of the other sides. And then usually people will go on the wider side of the bag to slice instead of the small side of the bag. But again, I don't think it really matters, right? I mean, it's going to pull all those nutrients anyways. If you do it on, so basically in this bag, right? If I were to cut on the two far sides here, right? So as I already mentioned, the top and the bottom is not necessarily the most ideal. So these are my options basically, right? If I were to do the small sides, then what happens is that when it starts growing out, imagine it's going to grow, you know, you're going to get an extra 1/2 foot, let's say, of mushrooms. If you're growing on both sides of the block simultaneously, you're looking at a full foot of extra space, right? Now, if I put on my humidity tents, I don't really have that. It doesn't really matter where I put my humidity tents. You know, it's going to be pushing up against that plastic, and that's not something that we particularly want. It's the same thing as misting the actual fruit bodies, right? You're kind of just pooling a bunch of moisture on top of the fruit bodies. So ideally what we're going to be looking at is something more like this, right? Where the mushrooms are coming out from these two ends, and there's actually that space in the fruit bag, in the humidity bag on either side of the block to allow for those fruit bodies, right? So that's why these two sides are basically the most ideal, but you might not choose to actually do that, right? Again, there's nothing that says you can't flip this around and do the front and the back, right? It's just that, you know, like I said, there's a seam on the bottom, there's the extra plastic on the top. It creates a bit more of an issue, but you know, why not? At the end of the day, this block wants to fruit, right? It wants to you know, spread its spores. So all you're doing is giving it the right conditions to do that, and it'll do that. But if you want to have the maximum yield, some beautiful fruit bodies, etc., then that's what you're looking for. So the holes in this bag will allow for certain airflow. What we're looking for when we're doing this, actually, I'll answer your question first, Corley, because it's kind of next up anyways. So the question is how much light to allow. So this is all indirect light. Some people will ask, you know, okay, should I put it in a window? Like, okay, well, if your window is north facing, or, you know, like I have my office window right here, the neighbor's house basically entirely blocks it from any light coming in. So theoretically, I could put it by the window there. It's all indirect light. But even I think that might be a little too much light. It's only looking for indirect light so that it can actually grow their mushrooms and kind of orient themselves, just to kind of know. But usually I find that they do that with gravity, not so much the sunlight. So they just kind of know which way is up and which way is down. They want their spores to drop down, right? So they'll orient themselves effectively. It's going to take anywhere between, usually it's like 4 to 14 days, depending on, you know, where your mycelium really stands at that time. So sometimes it can take a little bit of time for it to fruit, and other times it's really fast. I mean, if I cut it right where it's already fruiting, it's probably only going to take 4 days to get that initial cluster, right? But I want it to keep growing. I don't want just a small amount. I want, you know, as big as possible. So at this stage, basically things that you're trying to keep in mind are the look of the mushrooms, right? So it's going to be fruiting. You need to keep an eye on those, right? You want to keep an eye on the humidity, on that temperature. But the most important thing to do is actually look at the health of the mushrooms that are being grown. If they look at all deformed, then there's usually a reason for that, right? They could be getting shriveled out because there's too much light or not enough humidity, right? They could be, a lot of times they could just be, you know, turning yellowish and then browning. And that can be, usually that's just because they're aging, right? They're getting a little too old. So if they're yellowing and browning, then you might need to pick them. Other times it could be too much carbon dioxide. There's not enough airflow, right? So that is something that we need to keep in mind. As soon as there's not enough airflow, there's too much carbon dioxide building up around it, then all those mushrooms start to kind of misshapen, and they could start browning. Essentially, they start aging that much faster, and trying to get rid of their spores that much faster. So we don't want them to do that, right? We want them to have an ideal scenario or ideal situation where they can get all that humidity, use up all those nutrients, take all the time that they want to do that, grow nice and flush, and then right when they're at that perfect large scale healthy bunch, we're basically going to take them off. When we do require this, I'm going to tell you this now, even though it's part of stage 4, everyone's going to have their mushrooms coming up at different times. So you can't wait until stage 4 to pick them if they come up, and that's why I'm going to mention it now. If you wait, you're going to get a whole bunch of old mushrooms that are collapsing on you, and you don't want that. So basically, once they are nice and full and healthy looking, and you say, that looks ready to go, then basically you're going to take them. Some people will actually cut them off. I don't really recommend that. And most mushroom farmers wouldn't. Usually what they would do is they would tell you to grab a little bag. This is my method anyways. So let's say the mushrooms are coming out here, right? Usually they'll come out on a cluster. So even if it's lion's mane or if it's oysters, right, it doesn't really change anything. All of them will have a central stub that goes into the substrate. You kind of want to get around that, and you want to peel off the entire cluster of mushrooms off that block, right? The goal is to reduce as much damage to the substrate and the mycelium as possible, but you also don't want to leave much of the fruit body, and that's why I don't use the knife. If I were to use the knife and cut it off, I'd be leaving a big chunk of old fruit body. And basically what's happening there is now you just harmed the mushroom fruit body, right? It doesn't really understand what's going on. It's kind of like if you were to just cut off a branch of a tree. What it's going to do is it's going to start sending some, repair energy in that direction. And we don't really want that, right? Because we want it to be fruity on the other side as well. If you are cutting on both sides, chances of you getting a third flush are pretty minimal. And that's because you have encouraged it to put all of its energy into that first both side fruiting capability. And so at that point, it doesn't really matter. You can use a knife or you can pull it off because your block is basically going to be finished at the end of that. If you cut on one side and then afterwards you're cutting on the other, then you really want to be careful when you're pulling it off so that you don't damage it too much. And then hopefully you can get a second flush. And in rare circumstances, you can get a third flush as well. You're going to need to kind of cut it into a new area. You might see that, if I cut on this side and this side, I might see that all those fruit bodies that are at the top are still there. And that would be a good time then to just kind of cut open the top and hopefully I can get, usually you're only going to get, a little handful on your third flush if you get anything at all. So, don't expect too much, but hey, if you can get a small handful, better than nothing, right? So that would be your third flush, which is again only really possible if you did one cut and then once that was finished, you did a second cut, and then once that was finished, you do a third to see if you can get anything. And that's basically it.